On this week's What the Ship, we head down under with an episode devoted to Australia. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. So, a plethora of news stories came across focused on Australia. And I have a large following in Australia. It's actually one of the top 5 countries where people from around the world watch me from. So, I thought, hey, let's devote an episode to Australia. Did a couple of episodes on New Zealand recently. So why not focus on Australia? And that's what we're going to do today. 5 stories that cover news coming out of the continent slash country of Australia, which, by the way, I should mention is the one continent I've never been to. Been to 6 of the 7 continents, even been to Antarctica, but I've never been to Australia. So hoping to get down there someday. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this week's stories. So before I jump into this week's stories, I want to make you aware of a project I just did. I just finished an article, submitted it in, entitled Six Oilers, the Supply Line Between America and Australia in 1942. This article is going to take several months to go through a peer review process. However, last month, I went on World War II TV. That's a YouTube channel. It's a fantastic channel. If you don't follow it and you love World War II, you need to follow Paul's channel. It's great. They're just starting one now on World War I TV. But I went on and talked about this project that I was working on. So I'll have a link in the show notes so you can head on over to it if you want to see it. You give you an idea about it. So my focus with the United States and Australia is a long one, and particularly I was looking at the issue here at the very beginning of World War II. All right, let's go ahead and jump into our first story. So story number 1, Svitzer reaches agreement in principle with the Australian Union. So we talked about this when the issue arose a few months ago. And this story has to deal with Maersk Lines and the operation of tugs in and around Australia. So Svitzer Australia, which is a subsidiary of Maersk Lines, Maersk is owned by AP Moller Maersk, have come to an agreement. Now, there was a disagreement between these two. As a matter of fact, Svitzer Australia was threatening a lockout. They were going to lock out the crews of the tugs which operate in Australian ports. And that would have been catastrophic if they had a shutdown of tugboat operations in and around in Australia. It was going to be an issue. This is dealing with 17 Australian ports. 75% of the Australian trade is dealing with this. Back in November of last year, they had this, and the Australia's Fair Work Commission basically ordered Svitzer Australia not to do the lockout because it would cripple the Australian ports. This goes back to the issue that they now have an agreement in place. It's supposed to go for voting by the membership between June 8th and 10th. And according to Svitzer Australia, we remain committed to delivering safe, reliable, and efficient harbor towage infrastructure and delivering the best possible service to our customers. Svitzer thanks customers for its patience during this period. This is a very contentious issue between AP Moller Maersk and the Australian tugboat crews. Obviously, there are issues with wages, with work hours, everything you can possibly imagine. This has been going on. It talks about the fact that the agreement in principle comes after 3 years of unsuccessful bargaining between Svitzer and the representatives of the Maritime Union of Australia, the Australian Institute of Marine and Power Engineers, and the Australian Maritime Officers Union. Yeah, there's multiple unions that usually deal with ship operations. And during this period of time, pay raises have been frozen. So obviously they want to resolve this. It also goes to a larger issue about foreign companies and operations in and around other countries. So Svitzer, which is Danish, owns and operates these tugboats that operate in Australian waters. And if you remember, we had a story not too long ago where we talked about how Maersk Lines was ending their coastal shipping service in and around New Zealand. They had started a dedicated shipping service. Now, there are other shipping services in and around New Zealand, but this was a dedicated one. They were going to hire New Zealand mariners to do this, and it lasted less than a year, and it collapsed onto itself. And so a lot of issues about nationalities and nations having their own shipping, especially on the coastal side. We talk about it a lot in the United States with something called the Jones Act. But here in Australia and New Zealand, you can see it playing out. All right, let's go ahead and jump to story number 2. So, story number 2 deals with a ban instituted by Australia over a bulk carrier and its multiple deficiencies. So, this is a GCAP story from Mike Schuller. The Panama flagged bulk carrier I'm going to say Babuza, Wisdom has been banned from Australian waters for a period of 90 days by the Australia's Maritime Safety Authority. Due to numerous detainable deficiencies, including a faulty rescue boat engine. It goes on down here. AMSA has issued several warnings to the company regarding other ships in their fleet and have been detained in recent years. This is a Taiwan-based well ship management and maritime consultant company that owns and operates the vessel. And during the inspection, a plethora of deficiencies, including the defective rescue boat engine, malfunctioning reserve batteries for the MF and HF radio systems, systematic maintenance and reporting failures within its safety management system. The AMSA said these deficiencies posed a significant risk both to the safety and environment, resulting in the immediate detention. Now, understand, even though this vessel is not an Australian flag vessel, since it comes into Australian waters under what's called port state agreements, countries have the right to inspect vessels to make sure they're meeting the minimum standards set by international laws and codes, particularly the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. And I have to say, Australia has been absolutely hammering ships about this. Just this look at stories over the past couple of months from GCAPTAIN shows you this. Australia bans Dutch ship amid crackdown on poor performers. Back in February, Australia bans MSC container ship for 90 days. November, bulker banned from Australian ports for 3 months. So Australia is exercising its port state agreements or port state authority to ensure that safer ships are coming into their waters. And they're doing this for the benefit of Australia. They're also doing it for the benefit of the crews on board these vessels. Some of these ships, should they get into danger or issues, would be in a precarious situation because of the poor material performance of some of those things. The rescue boat, for example, is a good example of that. Radios, batteries for radios for distress. All these things need to be done. And arguably, all nations need to better exercise port state authority over ships coming into port. The problem is the volume of vessels coming in and the fact that many ships go into nations that don't have good port state authority. In the U.S., it's the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard will board. The problem is the Coast Guard is smaller in terms of personnel than the New York City Police Department. They just don't have the manpower, or the person power, I should say, to inspect every vessel. And so vessels are coming into port in poor material state. Matter of fact, you're going to see an issue with that coming up here in a second. So I really want to laud the Australia's Maritime Safety Authority for cracking down on this. This should be a worldwide phenomenon. We should see this happening around the world and talking about this and highlighting ships that are coming in poor condition, because these ships are a danger to the environment, to the crews, and to the nation states that they service. A big hats off to AMSA. All right, let's go to our next story. This story builds on that. Here's a Mike Schuller story. Australia convicts the ship operator and master after a PilotLadder fall injury. All right, so I have friends who are pilots, and I have one friend who was hurt falling off a vessel because of a situation akin to this. This is a subject that I am very passionate about, and that is the safety of pilots. So ships coming in and out of ports in many places are required to embark a domestic pilot. Pilots provide basically guidance to the ship's masters, assistants in navigating through waters they may be unfamiliar with. Pilots take years of training to get to the level where they're proficient taking vessels in. Now, pilots are not perfect. We've seen that. We've seen that with Ever Given in the Suez. We saw it with Ever Forward in coming out of Baltimore. Pilots are not foolproof by any means. They provide assistance to the master. Ultimately, the master is the ultimate arbiter of what happens on board their ship, except in two cases. One is the Panama Canal, where the pilots actually take over the vessel, and coming into a dry dock. Everywhere else, the master is ultimately responsible. But for a pilot to do their job, they have to be able to embark on the vessel. And one of the biggest hazards is pilot ladders, is being able to get on and off a vessel. And here's a case where Australia convicted not just the master of the vessel, but the ship operator. So in Perth, Australia, the master and operator of a Cyprus flagged cargo ship was indicted for substandard pilot ladder. The case was represented again by the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, AAL Dampier Navigation Company Limited, company behind the ship AAL Dampier, and the ship's master were found guilty of breaching safety regulations that led to the accident in August of 2022. So as the ship is departing the port of Fremantle on August 24th, a Marine pilot, while in the process of disembarking the vessel, climbing down the pilot ladder, was injured after falling from the pilot ladder. The rope snapped, causing him to fall 7 meters onto the deck of a pilot boat. Now, 50-50, better to fall on the pilot boat, fall in the water. Water is dangerous because you're between the pilot boat and the vessel. You can get sucked into the propellers. There's a whole myriad of issues problem here. So the vessel was boarded, inspected, and they discovered and seized segments of the ropes, which upon examination were found to be seriously defective and unfit for the purpose assigned to it. The neglect of proper storage and ineffectual inspection routines were identified as the probable cause of the poor state of the rope. Now, rope is very easily inspected. You open it up, you twist it, and you see to make sure the fibers aren't damaged, corroded, or rotted. And one of the big problems that happens is pilot ladders are just dumped back up on the vessel. They're wet. They get mildewed. They just degenerate. And unfortunately, no one really spends the time to properly check this. And so what you have right now is the vessel's master is faced with charges for not ensuring the safe disembarkation process for the pilot as mandated by Marine Order 21, passed by in 2016, and additionally are held accountable under the Navigation Act of 2012 for taking an unfit vessel to sea. Now, the master pled guilty to both counts and was imposed a fine of $5,500. Not exactly a whopping damage here. But the conviction does serve as a reminder here that these vessels have to meet these standards. And let's be clear, it's very well articulated what the standard is. I mean, there's literally a site here, PilotLadder Safety, that talks about all this. It has all the resources you need. It talks about all the news of what happens to pilots. And the International Maritime Organization has handouts like this for what is required of the boarding arrangements. What are pilot ladders supposed to be? How to rig them? The safety involved in this. We had a discussion on this channel about this, about why pilots, for example, don't have a safety harness and they're hooked on with a safety rope to it. And there was a lot of discussion about it. I should mention that it was really interesting because some pilots came back and said they would not want that because they want to be able to get off the pilot ladder quickly and disengage. And if they were harnessed to the vessel, that would be a problem. I got to say, I disagree a little bit with it. I think there's a quick safety disconnect that you can use in cases like this from both sides, either from the pilot vessel attached to the pilot or on the vessel itself. I do rappelling and rope rescues for my fire department, and redundancy is always the issue here. And I feel like there's always that issue. And having boarded vessels and come off vessels, I have to tell you, there's a moment there where your life is in jeopardy all the time. And it's one of the reasons why we see such absolute insanity when it comes to ensuring the safety of pilots. There is no way you can not do enough to ensure this. And this case, while a very negligible fine was imposed, still goes back to the issue of demonstrating that the ship's master and the ship's company are responsible for it. It nowhere near equates to what happened to this pilot falling 7 meters onto a pilot boat. That is just absolutely, I can't even tell you how bad that is. All right, let's go ahead and head over to story number 4. So story number 4 takes us on board a cruise ship off the coast of Australia. This comes from a maritime executive. Passengers mustered after fire aboard a P&O cruise ship. So the vessel in question here was the Pacific Adventure. This took place on Sunday morning. This was published back in May 28th. Hundreds of passengers were mustered in preparation for a possible evacuation after fire broke out aboard a cruise ship. At about 0330 hours local time, fire broke out in the cabin balcony aboard the B&O cruise ship Pacific Adventure. I'm going to say smoking. The ship was about 15 nautical miles off the coast of New South Wales at the time. The crew activated standard fire protocols, including mustering all passengers and crew in a common area. Luckily, the fire was contained to a small number of cabins and no one was hurt. We went into the hallways. We could definitely smell smoke, said passenger Emma Llewellyn to 9 News Sydney. So let me be clear about a couple of things. Number one, fire on board a vessel is something you don't mess around with at all. So I understand. I've been on cruise ships many times, and much like being in a hotel or a cruise ship, when the fire alarm goes off, nobody wants to get up and evacuate. But let's be clear. You need to do that on a ship. Fire is the most deadliest enemy, especially on a cruise ship where people are going to get hurt. What the crew needs to do is get you the hell out of the way. I'm not going to be very blunt about this. You need to get the heck out of the way because they need to be able to operate. They need to know that you're safe, that you're not in danger, and they need to be able to get their firefighting crews in there to put the fire out. And let's be clear, fire extends very quickly on a ship because of air conditioning and heating and ventilation. It's going to jump into ducts and go into neighboring rooms, and you have to check for extension. You have to make sure the biggest danger isn't where the fire is that the fire is going other places. Plus, you're on a metal ship. Heat radiates up, down, below, side to side. You got to clear all the area around it. It takes a lot to ensure that. So when you hear a fire alarm on a ship, don't ask questions. Just do what you're supposed to do. There's a safety meeting at the very beginning on a ship, which almost nobody pays attention to. You really should. I have to tell you, every time I go on a cruise ship, I am anal about this. I will look around, find where the nearest fire extinguishers are, my egress routes are, where the life rafts are, because I am not getting in a lifeboat with any of you. I'm going to tell you that much right now. Lifeboats on a cruise ship are... forget about it. You're going to be packed to the death in there. I'm looking for life rafts. Life rafts are the way to go. But more importantly, on fire, you want to make sure that you evacuate the area. If you can put the fire out quickly, do so. If you find yourself with fire, be clear. Shut doors. Understand when fire happens on a ship, those big, huge steel doors are going to start shutting on you. So beware of that when they're closing. You don't get yourself caught by them. But they're going to start to isolate those areas, and just find yourself a little spot, clear up on the weather deck, and hunker down for a few minutes while the crew goes to task to get that fire out. So really hats off to the crew on board the Pacific Adventure for doing that. And let's be clear, cruising in Australia is a huge industry. So I pulled this up from the latest report by CLIA. This is the Cruise Line Industry Association, and this is their global view of where passengers are. Now, obviously, this is really distorted because of what happened as a result of COVID. But this shows you passenger volume in thousands. So, for example, North America in 2019, you had about 15.4 million. It's 15.4 thousands. So Australia, New Zealand, Pacific, 1.3 million, or almost 1.4 million in 2019. And obviously it decreased because of COVID, but one of the things you're seeing is it's ticking, of course, back up. But notice where it falls. It is still holding in roughly around fourth place. And you can expect within the next year or so to see that number back to 2019 levels, if not surpassing it. And there's a lot of people who are cruising in this area. It's a huge industrial area for cruising. And so Australia and cruising off the coast there, you see a lot of opportunities to do it. And cruise ships operating are always, there's a risk involved. We just had a story here in the United States of a cruise ship coming into the U.S. over Memorial Day weekend where it hit bad weather. You're taking a chance going on a cruise ship on the weather issue. This chart also interesting in that Australia area tends to be older cruisers. It's one of the oldest group. So the average age is between 49 and 50, and the average length of a cruise is roughly around 7 days, which makes sense. I mean, if you're on an Australian cruise going around, it tends to be people who have money because of the cost involved to travel to Australia. This is where you see it taking place. So a really interesting statistic here about cruising in and around Australia. All right, story number 5 also comes from Australia, and one of my favorites. I've had her on the show doing an interview, and we're going to get her back on because we want to talk about this a little bit more. Is Alison Cusack. Now, Alison came on when we were talking about the fire that took place in the port of Iskendron following the earthquake there. So we did a whole series of episodes following that event, and then Allison came on, who is a maritime attorney and an expert in the field of cargo and shipping containers. And one of the projects she was working on at the time was this Container Jack. She launched a digital comic book about container shipping, and I got to say, this is right up my alley. How can I not love this? This story over at Splash 24/7, our buddy Sam Chambers writing it here, talks about that. Alison Cusack, principal lawyer at the Melbourne based law firm, told Splash the genesis for the new publication dated back to 2021 and the famous grounding of the Ever Given container ship, which blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days. Quote, I wanted to give a way to get the public excited about shipping again in a fun, informative way, but also give something back to the industry I love so much. Thus, Container Jack was born. So she's gonna this comic was gonna follow 5 common issues with container shipping, and fortunately, we have a preview here of it. I'll go ahead and put this up here. I'm gonna get my big melon out of the way so you can see it here. This is the issue that she has right here. I'm just gonna cycle through here a little bit. So she talks about why the comic book was created, talks about issues, for example, container overboard, what happens when your container falls overboard, talks about container fire, what happens when your hazard goods are not properly packed or declared, talks about containers lost, what happens if your containers are damaged or lost because of weather or other bad weather, container leak, what happens when things leak on a container, and then finally container violence. And talks about that issue. And then, of course, talking about the special bonus, which I have to find out about because, again, I'm hoping to see something great with this one episode on the Ever Given Tokyo drifting in the Suez. How can I not? I mean, this is where this channel came from. So anything that deals with Ever Given in the Suez is always going to get my juices going. It's a great topic for us. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, especially to everyone down in Australia. I want to thank everybody down in Australia who tunes in and watches this. I'm really touched by the international connections I have. I know I tend to focus more on American, but I do try to keep everything global as much as I can. So I thought this episode devoted to 5 stories from Australia would be perfect. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a thumbs up. And if you can, support the channel. Yes, I do take Australian dollars. So if you feel free, you can hit that super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a patron of the page, either monthly or yearly. I'll have links to all 5 shows in the show notes, including over to Allison's Container Jack comic book, and look forward to an episode with Allison where we go a little bit more in detail and break down the comic book and talk about it. Until our next episode, this is Sal signing off.